The ground hadn't killed me again. I came back through the checkpoint with mud caked to my knees and the afternoon light slanting low across the marshalling yard. 7th point walk this rotation. 7 times out and 7 times back, which put me ahead of the statistical curve by a margin that felt less like luck and more like a debt coming due. The squad was already assembled by the crawler when I got there. 23 men standing in the mud beside 30 tons of Imperium armor that we serviced, screened for, and were forbidden to ride in. Dorsey saw me coming and gave me the nod that meant everything looked the same as when I'd left. Orders unchanged, everyone present, nothing new to report. Just waiting. I fell in at the edge of the group. My legs ached from 8 hours of walking terrain that had been shelled, mined, shelled again, and then mined by someone else who'd forgotten where the first mines were. The Imperium's cartography didn't track human-scale hazards. That was what point walkers were for. The Veth overseer stood on the crawler's forward platform with a tablet in its hands. Tall, grey-skinned, wearing the translator collar that let it speak in something close to human language. The Veth served under the Imperium longer than we had. An older subject species, elevated far enough to pass orders down the chain. This one had a name I couldn't pronounce, so we called it Grey, like we called all of them. Grey's voice came through the collar with the quality that meant the words had passed through 3 translation layers before reaching us. Whatever the original Imperium officers said in their own language, by the time it got to Grey and then to us, it had been stripped of tone, context, personality. Just information. Deployment orders. Ridge 447 Sigma. Forward screening for armor advance. Departure at dawn. The formation held. 23 men in mud-stiff fatigues. Breathing, blinking, listening. Ridge assignments were common. We screened for infantry and armor. Walked ahead, drew fire. Found the hazards. But I saw Breck's shoulders tighten and Tolman look at the ground. And Hunreis, who'd survived 3 conscription waves and knew the briefing maps better than anyone, let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. Ridge 447 Sigma. I knew that designation. Everyone who'd been here more than a rotation knew it. Grey continued reading. Grid coordinates, departure time, equipment manifest, duration of expected engagement. The words washed over the squad like cold water, and I watched faces go blank, watched men retreat into whatever internal space they'd built to survive information like this. Dismissed to preparation. Ration distribution in 1 hour. The squad broke apart slowly, moving toward the equipment sheds and the ration station with the heavy steps of men who'd learned not to think too far ahead. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching them go. Henri's passed close enough to speak without being overheard. 11 times. He didn't need to say more. Ridge 447 Sigma had changed hands 11 times in the last 2 years. A salient in the line that looked valuable on maps and was worthless in practice. A low spine of rock and mud overlooked by enemy positions on 3 sides. Every force that took it held it until they couldn't, then fell back or died. And then someone else's infantry walked up the same slope to do it again. 11 times. The Imperium had sent conscripts up that ridge 11 times. I collected my ration chit from the distribution point and moved through the yard, not going anywhere in particular, just walking because walking was what I did. The marshalling area sprawled across what had been farmland once, before the war came through. Now it was mud and prefabricated shelters and the massive tracked crawlers of the Imperium's armor divisions, their alien geometries rising like monuments to something we weren't meant to understand. Other squads were in the yard too, waiting for their own orders, cycling through preparation for their own deployments. I passed a group unloading casualties from a transport, men on stretchers, men walking with assistance, men not walking at all. The transport had 3rd cohort markings. I didn't know any of them personally, but I knew what a 40% return rate looked like. A point walker from 3rd sat on an ammunition crate near the medical tent, staring at nothing. Someone had wrapped a bandage around his left hand, but blood was already soaking through the gauze. I walked past him and kept going. There was nothing either of us needed from the other. Further on, I caught fragments of conversation from a cluster of conscripts waiting outside the comm shack. Words drifted across to me in pieces. Heard they're pushing the whole sector. And 3 days, maybe 4. And doesn't matter, we're all going to the... The last speaker saw me looking and cut himself off, and the group fell silent. I moved on. By the time I reached the equipment shed, most of my squad was already there, checking the carbines we'd been issued. Old models, chemical propellant, low stopping power. The Imperium's frontline troops carried weapons that made ours look like toys, energy-based systems that could burn through armor plating. We got hand-me-downs from conflicts that had ended before most of us were born. I found my weapon on the rack where I'd left it and ran through the maintenance check I'd done 100 times before. Charging handle, magazine release, firing selector. Everything functioned the way it was supposed to function. It wouldn't change anything that mattered. Tolman was at the rack beside me, cleaning his barrel. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You walked the east sector today?" "South, past the old processing plant." "Find anything?" 2 pressure plates. Marked them." "Anyone else on that route?" "Just me." Tolman nodded and kept cleaning. He was from the same conscription batch as me, which meant we'd survived the same 2 years without forming anything close to friendship. Conscripts learned names because we needed to know who was screening on our left flank, who was carrying the spare ammunition, who would drag us to cover if we went down. That was all. Attachment was a liability. Everyone who'd lasted more than 6 months understood that without being told. I finished my check and moved to the ration station, where a Veth auxiliary was distributing meal packets. 1 packet per conscript, same content every time. Compressed protein, carbohydrate wafer, hydration tablet. Enough calories to keep a human body functional for 24 hours. Nothing more. I took my packet and found a spot near the equipment shed where I could sit with my back against the prefab wall and watch the yard. The sun was getting low, throwing long shadows across the mud. In a few hours it would be dark, and the night cycle cold would settle in, and we'd retreat to the conscript shelter to wait for dawn. Dawn. And then the ridge. I ate the protein brick without tasting it, and watched a Veth maintenance crew working on one of the crawlers. They moved, speaking to each other in their own language, a clicking, glottal sound that the translator collars didn't bother converting for human ears. The Veth had served under the Imperium for centuries, I'd heard. Long enough that they'd forgotten what independence felt like. Long enough that serving the masters had become their only way of being. I wondered if humans would get there eventually, if we lasted long enough. Gray found me as I was finishing my rations. The overseer approached without urgency, tablet still in hand, and stopped about 3 meters away, far enough to maintain the distance that Veth always kept from conscripts, close enough to speak without raising its voice. "Stark, Point Walker designation 741. I stood up. Not because I wanted to, but because you stood when an overseer spoke to you. Your survival duration has been flagged by the assignment system. 2 standard years, 4 months, 18 days. 97.3% above mean survival rate for your designation. I let the numbers pass through me. I'd survived longer than I should have. The system had noticed. Those facts didn't open any doors. Gray continued. For the Ridge deployment, you will be assigned cohesion responsibility. You will ensure forward momentum among your unit during engagement. You will report any failures of compliance to your command structure. Cohesion responsibility. I knew what that meant. I was supposed to keep the squad moving forward when they wanted to stop. I was supposed to report anyone who froze, anyone who ran, anyone who refused. I was the Imperium's eyes inside my own unit, and if the unit failed, I failed. I understand. You will receive no additional equipment or authority. Your designation remains Point Walker. Your compensation remains standard conscription rate. Your performance will be evaluated upon completion of engagement. Completion of engagement. As if any of us would be alive to be evaluated. I understand. Gray held my gaze, or gave the appearance of it, though I'd never been able to tell what Veth's eyes were actually seeing. Then it turned and walked away, already consulting its tablet for whatever task came next. I watched it go and felt nothing. That was the secret I'd learned. The thing that had kept me alive when others died. Not special bravery or talent or luck. Just the ability to stay empty when feeling something would have made me hesitate, stumble, break. The Imperium needed bodies that walked forward. I'd become very good at walking forward. The evening came slow and cold. I collected my bedroll from the equipment shed and made my way to the conscript shelter with the rest of the squad, filing through the entrance into the long, low space where 20-some men slept in shifts on bedding that hadn't been cleaned in months. The air inside was thick with heat from too many bodies, and I found my assigned section near the back wall, where I could see the entrance and both emergency exits. The shelter was never quiet. Men snored, muttered, shifted in their sleep. Someone was always awake, always moving, always coughing or cursing or getting up to use the latrine pit outside. The rhythms of conscript life didn't include rest, just varying degrees of exhaustion. I lay on my bedroll and stared at the ceiling and did something I'd trained myself not to do. I calculated. The ridge, 447 Sigma. I'd seen the terrain maps in the briefing archives back when I still thought information might help me survive. A low spine of rock and mud, maybe 200 meters of defensible ground along the crest. Approach from the south, where the Imperium's lines were. Enemy positions to the north, east and west. Elevated terrain, fortified emplacements, overlapping fields of fire. 23 conscripts with obsolete carbines and no support weapons. Armor behind us that would use our position to draw fire and identify targets. Air assets allocated elsewhere. No scheduled extraction, because screening infantry weren't counted in extraction plans. We went up the ridge. We stayed on the ridge until we couldn't. Then the armor pushed through, or it didn't. And either way, we stopped appearing in the calculations. 11 times. That ridge had been taken and lost 11 times. I ran the numbers in my head. Engagement duration, enemy strength, ammunition supply, casualty rates from similar deployments. The math didn't require complex work. Even exhausted, even in the dark, even with my mind trying to drift away from the answer, I could see it. The ridge wasn't strategic. It wasn't valuable. It sat there because the map said a line should run through it, and someone in a logistics cell had decided that line needed to be contested. Contesting it required bodies. Bodies required inventory. That was what we were. Inventory. The thought should have made me angry. Should have pulled up something. Rage, despair, the burning clarity of injustice. But I lay in the dark and felt what I always felt now. Nothing. A hollow space where emotion used to live, emptied out by 2 years of walking forward into things that should have killed me. We were inventory. The ridge was disposal, and in a few hours the sun would rise and we would walk toward it anyway. Someone in the shelter was crying. Quiet sounds, muffled in a bedroll, barely audible over the ambient noise. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. Whoever it was would probably be dead by tomorrow night, and so would half the rest of us, and the Imperium would mark the inventory as expended and assign new conscripts to the next deployment. I closed my eyes and waited for dawn. The transport dropped us 2 kilometers out in the dark before dawn. We walked the rest. 23 men moving single file through terrain that had been fought over so many times the ground itself was more shrapnel than soil. I took point because that was what point walkers did, and the familiar dissociation settled over me like a second skin. My body moving, my eyes reading the ground, and whatever was left of me watching from somewhere behind my own skull. The route was bad. Not mined as far as I could tell, but churned into a maze of old craters and collapsed trenches that made every step uncertain. Twice I had to stop and find a new path when the way forward turned out to be impassable. The men behind me followed in silence. No one needed to ask questions we already knew the answers to. We reached the ridge as the sky was just starting to grey at the eastern edge. I could make out the shape of it in the darkness. A low spine of rock and mud rising maybe 15 meters above the surrounding terrain. From the briefing maps, I knew it ran roughly east-west for about 200 meters, with the approach slope on our side and a steeper drop on the north face. Enemy territory. Henry's moved up beside me at the base of the slope. He studied the ground, then pointed toward the western end where a cluster of old fighting positions had been dug into the ridge's face. There. That's where 3rd Cohort tried to hold last month. I could see the positions now. Shallow scrapes in the earth, partially collapsed, with the rubble of previous occupants scattered around them. Empty ration packets, spent casings, a single boot lying on its side. No bodies. The Imperium left conscript remains where they fell. Scavengers finished the rest. We spread out along the ridge and started digging. The tools we'd been issued were folding shovels with short handles, designed for portability rather than efficiency. The ground was hard clay mixed with rock fragments and the occasional piece of something that might have been metal or might have been bone. I didn't look closely. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, we had something like defensive positions. Shallow holes scraped into the ridge face, barely deep enough to lie flat in, with low berms of loose soil in front. I was in a position near the center of our line with Breck on my left and Tolman on my right. The spacing between us was maybe 10 meters. Standard screening formation. Close enough to support each other, far enough apart that a single burst wouldn't take all three. The sun rose over enemy territory, and I got my first clear look at what we were facing. The terrain north of the ridge dropped away into a shallow valley, then rose again to a series of low hills that marked the enemy's forward positions. I could see the outlines of their emplacements, dark shapes against the lighter earth, evenly spaced along the ridgeline. 3 distinct positions to the north. 2 more to the northeast, angled to cover the eastern approach. And to the northwest, partially hidden by a fold in the terrain. Something larger. A command position, maybe, or heavy weapons. We held the only cover in a bowl of fire. I checked my carbine again. Full magazine. 2 spares in my pouch. 60 rounds total. The math was simple. If the enemy advanced, 60 rounds per man would disappear in seconds. If they stayed at range, 60 rounds might last until nightfall. Either way, the carbine was almost beside the point. We weren't here to win a firefight. We were here to occupy space and see what happened to us. The morning crawled by. Sunlight crept across the ridge, warming the clay, drying the mud from last night's dew. Men adjusted their positions, checked their weapons, did the small, pointless tasks that soldiers did when waiting for something bad to happen. I watched the enemy positions through the crude optic, mounted on my carbine, and saw no visible movement. They knew we were here. They were waiting too. Around mid-morning, Breck shifted in his hole and spoke without looking at me. "They're not coming." "No. They don't need to come. They can just sit there and watch us." He was right. The enemy held the high ground on 3 sides. Their emplacements covered every approach, every piece of open ground. If they wanted the ridge back, they could push down with overwhelming numbers. They weren't doing that. They had another plan. The first shot came just before noon. I didn't hear it at first. Just saw Perrin jerk backward in his position about 30 meters to my right, and then he was down, and there was movement around him as the men on either side tried to figure out what had happened. A moment later, the sound reached us. A flat crack from somewhere to the north, followed by the delayed echo bouncing off the hills. Then silence. The enemy position that had fired went still again, and we were left staring at the place where Perrin had been while his body bled out into the clay. I pressed myself flat against the bottom of my hole and waited. 30 seconds. A minute. No follow-up shots. No barrage. One round, precisely placed, and then nothing. A test. The realization came slowly, filtering through the adrenaline and the fear. They were probing us. One shot to see how we reacted, where we moved, what we did, gathering information. We were the experiment. They were taking notes. Perrin was still alive when Dorsey crawled over to help him. I could hear the sounds from my position, wet, gurgling noises that meant the round had gone through his throat. Dorsey tried to apply pressure, tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much blood and Perrin kept trying to breathe and couldn't. It took him almost 10 minutes to die. Nobody else got hit. Nobody else moved. We lay in our holes and listened to him drown. After that, the shots came irregularly, one every few minutes, sometimes longer gaps, never a pattern you could predict. Each time a single round from a different position, aimed at a different section of our line. Solka caught one in the belly around 1400 hours and let out a long, ragged cry before it faded. A kid from 4th section, I never learned his name, stood up at the wrong moment to adjust his position and took a round through the face that removed everything above his jaw. By mid-afternoon, we'd lost 7 men. 7 rounds fired. 7 dead or dying. Perfect accuracy. I understood the pattern now. The enemy wasn't trying to wipe us out. They were mapping our positions. Each time one of us moved, each time we reacted to a shot, they learned something new about where we were dug in, how we were spaced, what our response patterns looked like. They were building a picture of our line one body at a time. And we had no way to break the pattern. Orders pinned us to the ridge. The approach slope below us was a kill zone. Our carbines didn't have the range to hit their emplacements, and blind fire would only tell them more about us. Our role was to lie in our holes and wait for the next round, and hope it wasn't aimed at our patch of dirt. The orbital strike came at 1547. Light flared in the sky, and the world came apart. The first strike hit the terrain north of the ridge, maybe 300 meters out, close enough that I felt the shockwave slam through my body, close enough that the flash left after images burning in my vision, far enough that the impact center wasn't under us. The enemy positions I'd been watching all day vanished in a column of fire and rubble that rose so high I lost sight of it against the sun. A second strike hit to the northeast. A third took the larger emplacement to the northwest. 3 impacts in rapid succession, each precisely placed, each absolutely devastating. The ground shook so hard I thought the ridge itself would collapse, and dust and rubble rained down on us for what felt like minutes afterward. When I could see again, the enemy positions were gone. Craters where the emplacements had been. Nothing moving on any of the hills. For a moment, one brief, stupid moment, I thought it was over. The enemy had been destroyed. We'd held. We could go home. Then the comm unit in Honris's position crackled to life, and Gray's translated voice came through with the same indifference it always carried. Targeting Phase 1 complete. Maintain position. Phase 2 targeting requires additional calibration. Expect continued engagement. I lay in my hole and stared at the sky and understood. The orbital strikes weren't support. They were the mission, the whole point. We hadn't been sent to hold the ridge. We'd been sent to draw enemy fire until the Imperium systems had enough data to feed to the orbital batteries. Every man we'd lost, every probing round that had found flesh, had been a data point, coordinates, calibration. The enemy had spent the day mapping us. The Imperium had spent the day mapping them. We were the measuring instrument, the part of the device that broke when you used it. The afternoon bled away. New enemy forces moved into position on the hills, reserves, fresh troops, a second line that had been held back during the orbital strikes. They started probing again. More single shots, more data points. I watched Varric take a round through the shoulder and keep firing because there was nowhere else to turn. I watched Collar curl into a ball at the bottom of his hole and refuse to move, and I didn't report him. The cohesion responsibility meant nothing out here except another line on someone's tablet. By evening, we were down to 12. 11 men and me spread across a ridge that had been designed for 3 times our number, surrounded by enemies who could kill us at their leisure. The comm unit crackled again as the sun touched the horizon. Maintain position through night operations. Relief will not be dispatched. Additional targeting calibration required for Dawn Phase 3. Hold until further notice. No extraction. No relief. No end. Just more waiting, more probing, more bodies to feed into the calculation. Onris was in the position next to mine now. He'd moved up after Tolman took a round through the chest and stopped breathing. His face was grey with dust and exhaustion, and when he looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in another conscript's eyes in a long time. A question. I looked away, back toward the enemy positions where new lights were appearing as night fell. Fires, maybe, or signal lamps. It didn't matter. Orders told us to stay on the ridge. Morning would bring more of the same until none of us were left to provide data. The sun dropped below the horizon. The temperature started to fall. Somewhere to the north, an enemy signal lamp blinked 3 times and went dark. 12 men on a ridge, waiting for dawn to finish the work. And the silence between us had shifted into something I didn't have a name for. Night on the ridge was cold in a way that sank through clothing and skin and settled into the bones. I lay in my hole and watched the stars appear overhead, bright and indifferent, while the temperature dropped and my body started to shake. The Imperium didn't issue cold weather gear to screening infantry. Our expected lifespan on assignments like this made long-term exposure a secondary concern. Enemy fire continued through the darkness. Their precision dropped when the light did. They switched from single, perfectly placed rounds to erratic bursts swept across our general position. Rounds cracked overhead or thudded into the berm in front of me. Harassment fire. Enough to keep us awake, to keep the fear fresh, to make sure none of us could rest or think or do anything except lie flat and count the gaps between bursts. I don't know how long I lay there before Breck spoke. Hours, maybe. The stars had shifted position, wheeling slowly overhead in patterns I'd never learned the names of. My hands had gone numb despite being tucked under my body, and my thoughts had narrowed to a single repeating loop. Morning, ridge, forward, death. "I'm not going over the top tomorrow," Breck said. Not angry, not defiant. Just a statement of fact, like he was commenting on the weather or the quality of the rations. In 2 years of conscription, I had never heard anyone say it that plainly. The enemy fired another burst. Rounds snapped overhead, closer this time, and I pressed myself tighter against the clay. When the burst ended, the silence that followed seemed louder than before. "Did you hear me?" I heard him. I heard him clearly, and I knew what the Imperium expected me to do. Cohesion responsibility. Report failures of compliance. That was my function. That was why Gray had pulled me aside and told me I was responsible for keeping the unit moving forward. I was supposed to report him. I stayed quiet. The night stretched on. I lay in my hole, listening to the enemy fire, and thought about the order I'd been given, and the morning that was coming, and the sentence Breck had spoken. "I'm not going." 4 syllables, the simplest possible refusal. And I had chosen not to carry it up the chain. That was the first act. The sin of omission. The crack in the wall. Sometime before dawn, maybe an hour, maybe 2, I crawled out of my hole and started moving down the line. Checking positions. That was the official justification. Making sure everyone was still alive, still oriented, still facing the right direction. I told myself that was what I was doing. It wasn't. I stopped at each position just long enough to see who was there, to let them see me, to read whatever I could in their faces in the darkness. Muss sat awake, eyes too wide, fingers wrapped around his carbine so tight the knuckles had gone white. Varric stayed conscious too, his wounded shoulder bound with strips torn from his undershirt, his face set against the pain. Dorsey watched the horizon. Unris watched me. I wasn't checking readiness. I was taking the temperature, trying to feel whether the thing Breck had said out loud had taken root anywhere else. It had. I could see it in the way they looked at me, in the silence that fell when I approached, the silence that wasn't just fear of enemy fire but something else. Waiting. The same thing I'd seen in their eyes at sunset. They were waiting for something, and I was starting to understand what it was. By the time the sky began to lighten at the eastern edge, I'd been to every position. I didn't speak the refusal directly. Neither did they. We circled it. We talked in fragments, in glances, in half-finished sentences. How much ammunition do you have left? Enough. Doesn't matter, does it? That was Dorsey. The way he said doesn't matter told me everything. Musk kept asking what the plan was. If we're going to do something, there has to be a plan, right? We can't just... He never finished the sentence. But he didn't tell me we had to follow orders either. Collar was different. I found him in his hole at the eastern end of the line, curled up with his knees against his chest, and when I asked how he was holding up, he looked at me with eyes that were more animal than human. Don't. One word. He knew what was spreading through the line, and he wanted no part of it. Everyone knew the stories about Veth enforcement squads and what they did to conscripts who refused orders. Collar would walk forward into enemy fire if that was what it took to avoid that alternative. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to convince him. I moved on to the next position and left him alone with his fear. The false dawn came first, that grey lightening of the sky that promised sunrise but didn't deliver. I made it back to my position and found Breck and Onris waiting for me, crouched in the shallow depression between their holes. Henri spoke first. How many? I thought about the question. How many were ready to refuse? How many had looked at me with that same waiting expression? How many had said things that meant yes without saying the word? 9, maybe 10, counting me. And the others? Collar's out. 2 more I'm not sure about. Henri nodded slowly. I could see the outline of his face now as the sky continued to lighten, the deep lines around his eyes, the grey in his beard, the expression that might have been understanding or pity, or both. He'd survived 3 conscription waves, more than anyone else I knew, more than anyone else who was still alive. If anyone understood what we were considering, what it meant, what would happen, they'll kill us anyway. I waited. We refuse. They kill us. We follow orders, the enemy kills us. Orbital strike, enemy fire, Veth enforcement squad. Does it matter which one? He shifted his weight, joints popping in the cold. What's the difference? It was a real question. He wasn't looking for a speech. He wanted to see if there was any difference I could name. I opened my mouth to respond and found that I didn't have words ready. The thing I'd been feeling all night. The thing that had kept me from reporting Breck, that had driven me down the line to take the temperature, that sat in my chest like a stone. I couldn't label it, couldn't build it into an argument. I don't know. Henri waited. I don't know what the difference is. I can't say it matters. I can't say there's a reason. The words came slowly, dragged up from somewhere deep. But I'm not walking into that again. I can't. My legs won't go, my body won't move. I've been trying to make myself feel something about tomorrow. Fear, anger, anything. And there's nothing. Just a wall. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't inspirational. It was the truest thing I'd said in 2 years. Henri nodded. Okay. That was all. Okay. And just like that, we were 8 instead of 6. The sun rose red over the enemy positions. Fresh troops had moved in during the night. I could see movement on the hills now, figures shifting between emplacements, the glint of metal catching the morning light. Whatever had survived the orbital strikes had been reinforced. The probing would start again soon. I moved down the line one more time, in the full light now, making the final count. Breck was in. Tolman was dead. Dorsey was in. Muss had stopped asking about the plan and just nodded when I passed his position. Varric was in, though his shoulder was worse. The bandage had soaked through and his face had gone pale. 5 others whose names I'd learned over the past 2 years were in. 9 total. 9 men who couldn't make themselves walk forward. Collar and 2 others were not. They stood apart from us, clustered at the eastern end of the line, not looking in our direction. They had made their choice too. Fear of the Veth, fear of what came after, fear of the unknown. It didn't matter which fear won. They were going to follow orders because that was the only path they could see. The comm unit crackled. Gray's voice translated. All units prepare to advance. Armor push commencing in 15 minutes. Forward screening positions to be established on Ridgecrest. Acknowledge. The 9 of us stayed where we were. We looked at each other across the holes and the mud and the bodies of the men who died yesterday. Looked at the enemy positions that had started firing again. Single shots cracking over our heads. Looked at the morning sky we were supposed to see for the last time. Then, without planning it, without discussing it, everyone's eyes settled on me. I don't know why. I wasn't the oldest or the most experienced or the most respected. I was just the one who'd spoken first. The one who'd said I can't. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all it took to become whatever I was becoming. The comm unit crackled again. Screening unit, acknowledge advance orders. I picked up the field unit from where Unris had left it. The plastic was cold in my hands, slick with morning dew. I looked at it for a moment. This small machine that linked us to the Veth, to the Imperium, to the vast machinery that had spent us like currency on this worthless ridge. I pressed the transmit button. No. The word went out into the morning air. 1 syllable. The simplest possible response. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of distance or interference, but the pause of something unexpected. I could imagine Gray on the other side, processing what it had heard, trying to fit the word into the framework of conscript behavior it understood. Screening unit, repeat last transmission. I pressed the button again. No, we're not advancing. We're not providing forward screening. We're done. More silence. Longer this time. I could feel the eyes of the 9 men behind me, watching. I could feel the weight of what I'd said settling over all of us. No taking it back now. No pretending it hadn't happened. When Gray's voice came again, it sounded exactly the same as always. Flat. Translated. Devoid of anger or surprise or threat. Acknowledged. Stand by for further instructions. The connection clicked off. I lowered the field unit and turned to face the others. Breck, Dorsey, Muss, Varric with his ruined shoulder, Enris with his 3 conscription waves of survival. The others. 9 men who had just refused a direct order from the Imperium. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. We had crossed the line, and now we waited to learn the price. At the eastern end of the line, Collar stared at us with an expression I couldn't read. Not hatred, not pity, something more complicated than either. He knew what we'd done. He knew what it meant for us. And he knew that when the Imperium answered, he would be on a different list. I didn't blame him. I didn't feel anything about him at all. He'd made his choice, and I'd made mine, and neither of us could say which one would turn out to be less fatal. The sun climbed higher. Enemy fire continued, single shots cracking over our heads, probing rounds searching for targets. But those rounds felt distant now. Whatever killed us, it wouldn't be them. The Imperium would handle that part. I sat down in my hole and waited for the consequence to arrive. The morning stretched long and empty after the refusal. I watched the sun climb higher and waited for retribution. Orbital fire on our coordinates, a Veth enforcement squad, chemical agents drifting over the ridge. The Imperium had options for dealing with conscripts who refused orders, and I'd heard stories about all of them. Men dissolved from the inside by tailored toxins. Men hunted through trenches by overseers with stun lances. Men erased from existence by fire from the sky. Their positions marked for targeting the same way enemy emplacements were marked. Nothing appeared. Enemy fire went on, single shots cracking over our heads, the same probing pattern as yesterday. But it felt like a different war now. We'd stepped out of that calculation with a single word and landed somewhere else. We just didn't know where. Breck crawled over to my position around mid-morning. His face was drawn, exhaustion and tension carved into the lines around his eyes. "How long do you think?" "I don't know. They have to respond. We can't just sit here." "We can, until they decide what to do with us." He watched the enemy positions on the northern hills. "Do you think they'll make it hurt?" The Imperium's cruelty wasn't personal. That was the thing I'd learned in 2 years of conscription. They didn't hate us. They didn't feel anything about us at all. We were inventory, and inventory didn't inspire emotion. It inspired logistics. Whatever they did to us would be processing, not punishment. The hours passed. The sun reached its peak and started to descend. The 9 of us stayed in our holes, conserving water, watching the terrain, existing in the strange suspended state between the order we'd refused and the consequence we couldn't predict. At the eastern end of the line, Collar and the 2 others who hadn't joined us stayed in their positions too, but they didn't look at us, didn't speak to us. They'd drawn a line and were staying on their side of it. The transport appeared in the late afternoon. I saw it first, a dark shape moving across the terrain from the south, following the same route we'd walked 2 days ago. A single crawler, smaller than the armor we'd been screening for, flying a white signal pennant from its forward antenna. Not a combat vehicle, administrative transport, the kind the Veth used for personnel movements and supply runs. I watched it approach. This was the answer. The crawler stopped at the base of the ridge, maybe 50 meters from our position. A hatch opened on the forward section, and a figure emerged. Tall, grey-skinned, wearing the translator collar. A Veth overseer. Not grey. This one was shorter, with darker markings on its face. A new handler for a new situation. It walked toward us without visible weapons, without guards, without any overt sign of threat. Just a tablet in its hands, and the flat bearing that all Veth carried. Conscript Unit 477, present for accountability. 9 men, mud-caked and exhausted, forming a rough line on the ridge face. At the eastern end, Collar and the other 2 stood separately, maintaining the distance they'd kept all day. The Veth overseer looked at us, then at its tablet, then back at us. "Unit status indicates refusal of direct deployment order. Confirm." I had spoken the refusal. I was still holding the field unit. That made me the obvious one to answer. "Confirmed." The overseer made a notation on its tablet. No change in expression, no visible reaction. Just data entry. Administrative processing. Individuals who participated in refusal stepped forward. 9 of us stepped forward. 1 pace. Enough to separate us from the 3 who hadn't joined. More notation, more data entry. The overseer's fingers moved across the tablet's surface, updating records, adjusting categories, reassigning inventory. Conscripts who refused direct order are hereby reclassified. Previous designation, screening infantry. New designation, clearance materiel. Effective immediately. The words reached me before the meaning did. Clearance materiel. I knew the term. Everyone did. That was what they called conscripts assigned to minefield duty. Not detection, not removal, clearance. You walked forward until something exploded, and then the people behind you knew where not to step. We had refused to screen for armor. Now we would clear mines with our bodies. The overseer continued. Transfer to Southern Front, Sector 884. Departure upon transport availability. Stand by for movement orders. Then it turned to Collar and the other two. Conscripts who complied with deployment order. Status: cleared for extraction and reassignment. Board transport for return to marshalling area. That was all. No speeches, no threats, no acknowledgement that what we'd done was rebellion or defiance or anything that required more than a category change in the system. We had refused an order, so our names moved to a different part of the ledger. The three who hadn't refused would be extracted, reassigned, sent to another ridge or another screening operation. They'd live a little longer, maybe. Or they wouldn't. Either way, they had done what they were supposed to do, and the system would continue to use them until they were used up. Collar walked toward the transport without looking at us. His steps were quick, the movements of a man trying not to think about what he was leaving behind. The other two followed. I watched them board, watched the hatch close behind them, watched the crawler's engines cycle up for departure. For a moment, Collar's face appeared in the small viewport on the transport's side. Our eyes met through the scratched plastic. I didn't know what I expected to see. Guilt, maybe. Relief, vindication. Something that would show he felt the weight of what had happened here. His expression was empty. Just a man looking out a window at other men he used to stand beside. Then the transport turned, and he was gone, and the 9 of us were alone on the ridge with our new designation. Clearance material. Effective immediately. I sat down in the mud and stared at the horizon where the transport had disappeared. The others did the same, finding spots on the ridge face, settling in to wait for whatever came next. Nobody spoke. I'd expected to feel something. Rage at the injustice. Despair at the outcome. Vindication that we'd forced the Imperium to notice us. Instead, I felt the old, familiar hollow. We had traded one form of being used for another. We would walk into a minefield instead of walking into interlocking fields of fire. Still walking forward, still being spent. Only the destination had changed. The sun was getting low when Mus made a sound. I looked over at him. He sat a few meters away, his carbine across his knees, staring at the ground. The sound he made was strange. Not a sob, not a curse. Short, startled, involuntary. He made it again, and this time I recognized it. He was laughing, not a mad laugh, not the broken sound of someone whose mind had come apart. Just a brief, incredulous burst of amusement, bubbling up through shock. The others turned to look at him. All of us watching Moose laugh at the mud and the dying light, and the future waiting for us in Sector 884. They're sending us to clear mines. He shook his head, still making that sound. We said no to dying on the ridge, so now we're dying in a minefield. We refused to walk forward there, so they're making us walk forward somewhere else. Another breath of laughter, trailing off into something quieter. And that's different? That's supposed to be different? The question hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on all of us. We had made our stand. We had spoken our refusal. They were going to kill us anyway. And the only thing that had changed was the paperwork. Mus looked at me. The laughter had faded, leaving something else behind. Not hope, not total despair, just a need to know whether any of this meant anything. So what was the point? I thought about the night before, the cold, the enemy fire. Breck's voice in the darkness, saying the thing that couldn't be unsaid. I thought about crawling down the line, taking the temperature, finding the same wall in all of them, that limit beyond which their bodies simply refused to go. I thought about picking up the field unit and saying no, and hearing the word go out into the morning. It's ours. Mus frowned. What? This one. I gestured at the ridge, the transport route, the southern horizon where the minefield waited. They told us to die on the ridge, and we said no. Now they're telling us to die in a minefield. We didn't stop them from killing us. We just chose that it wouldn't be here. I searched for the words, found them waiting somewhere I hadn't expected. We picked which way we go. That choice is ours, not theirs. It wasn't a good answer. It wasn't even accurate in any strict sense. The Imperium had chosen the minefield, not us. They had chosen Sector 884 and clearance materiel and every step we would take until something exploded under our feet. We hadn't escaped the system. We had just pushed back once before it closed around us again. But Muss nodded, slowly, like he was trying the idea on for size. Ours. Yeah. The others watched. Breck, Dorsey, Varric with his ruined shoulder, Honris with his 3 conscription waves of survival. They looked at me the same way they'd looked at me before I spoke the refusal, waiting, searching for something I wasn't sure I had. I didn't give them a speech. I didn't tell them it would be all right. I didn't pretend that what we'd done had changed our fate in any large way. We're still going to die, probably soon, probably badly. I looked at each of them in turn. But we're the ones who decided it wouldn't be here. We're the ones who said no. Maybe that counts for nothing. Maybe it's a tiny thing. But it belongs to us. Silence followed. The sun touched the horizon, painting the ridge in shades of red and orange. Enemy positions lit up again on the northern hills. Fresh troops settling in for the night, preparing for tomorrow's operations against whatever conscripts the Imperium sent to replace us. Henri spoke. I've been doing this for 6 years. 3 waves, 14 different assignments. He watched the sun set, not any of us. This is the first time I ever said no to anything. Was it worth it? He considered the question. I don't know. Ask me when I'm stepping on the mine. Breck laughed at that. A short, harsh sound, nothing like Muss's earlier incredulity. But it was still laughter, and it was still real, and it meant something, though I couldn't have said what. The transport for the Southern Front arrived after dark. Another crawler, larger than the one that had taken Collar and the others. This one carried markings I didn't recognize, sector designations, unit codes, the bureaucratic shorthand of Imperium logistics. A Veth driver sat in the forward compartment, not looking at us as we approached. We boarded in silence. 9 men climbing into the transport bay, finding seats on the metal benches that lined the walls. No restraints, no guards. We were infantry in transit, and infantry didn't require supervision. It just required movement. The engine cycled up. The crawler lurched into motion, turning south, leaving the ridge behind. I found a spot near the rear of the bay where I could see out the small viewport in the door. The ridge was visible for a few minutes as we pulled away, a dark shape against the lighter sky, already shrinking in the distance. By tomorrow, the Imperium would send another conscript unit to take our place. They'd dig into the same holes, face the same enemy positions, provide the same targeting data. The war would continue with or without us. The ridge disappeared behind a fold in the terrain, and then it was just darkness and the sound of the engine and the 9 of us sitting in the transport bay, heading south. Muss sat across from me, his head leaned back against the wall, his eyes closed. Breck sat beside him, cleaning his carbine. The others were scattered along the benches, each enclosed in his own silence. I thought about the minefield waiting for us. Sector 884. I didn't know its size, density, or pattern. It didn't matter. The math was simple. We would walk forward until we didn't, and then the people behind us would know where not to step. I thought about Collar, riding north in a different transport, heading back to the marshalling area for reassignment. He had made the safe choice, as far as any choice in conscription could be called safe. He would live a little longer, maybe find a deployment that wasn't an obvious death sentence, maybe last another year or 2 before his number came up. Or he would die tomorrow on some other ridge, some other screening operation, and the choice he'd made today would turn out to change nothing at all. I didn't know which of us was right. I wasn't sure the war allowed a right answer. The transport kept moving, and I closed my eyes, and somewhere in the darkness, I felt something settle inside me. A small, hard kernel that hadn't been there before. The knowledge that I had said no. That I had made a choice, even if the choice was only which column of the ledger would list my name. That for one moment on that ridge, I had stopped walking forward because someone else told me to, and started walking forward because I decided to. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't meaning. It wasn't anything I could explain or defend or hold up as proof that the refusal had mattered. The transport rumbled south through the darkness, and the 9 of us rode in silence, and somewhere ahead, a minefield waited for us to walk into it.